In Tehran, there's a lot of censorship. Certain books, films, TV shows, they're restricted. Sometimes the government puts Hollywood blockbusters on TV, like Gravity with Sandra Bullock. And since she spends a lot of the movie in shorts, they CG some clothes on. Officially, that's all that's available. But in reality, you can get just about anything you want.
In most cases, you just have to know a guy. And everybody knows a guy.
It's like 75 cents for a pirated DVD. So Jason and Yegi Rezaian are sitting in their apartment in Tehran, watching season 3 of Homeland. It's 2014, and they're both working as reporters. Jason for the Washington Post and Yegi for the National. And it's a good time to be a reporter in Iran. The country is smack dab in the middle of nuclear negotiations with world powers. And an interim deal is already in place. So it's no surprise that Homeland makes its way to Iran. Episodes often track with current events.
If he is a terrorist, we need eyes and ears on Brody from the minute he steps off that plane.
Out of the question.
If you haven't seen the show, the first couple of seasons follow a returned American prisoner of war who's secretly been recruited by al-Qaeda.
Marine Sergeant Nicholas Brody, MIA since early 2003 and presumed dead. Until now.
That's wrong. That's wrong.
Jason and Yegi are having a little fun picking the show apart.
That accent is wrong. That expression is not fit for this occasion.
There are some major holes. At one point, the protagonist, Carrie, walks into the office of one of the most hardline branches of Iran's military, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard.
And there was a female secretary. And Yegi was like, there's no way that the IRGC has a lady sitting at their front desk receiving guests.
Then they get to this famous scene when Sergeant Brody comes to the end of the line. He marches silently to the middle of a public square as Carrie, at this point his lover, watches in shock. A woman spits in his face before placing a red noose around his neck, and the crowd cheers as the crane that holds the noose is raised above the square. At the time, did you feel like it was a fair representation of Iran?
No.
You're both shaking your head. No, absolutely.
Not at all.
They're like, these kind of things don't actually happen in Tehran. Then, a few weeks later, Yegi sits down to watch the news.
It was just another normal day. I was working from home on my email, and I received a very weird email. I've never received anything like that.
And not thinking too much about it, she clicks.
So soon after, within like a few minutes, I realized my iPhone was giving me this message that my Gmail password is being changed.
Suddenly, everything starts moving really fast.
Within a few minutes, I received the same message about my Facebook. I started getting very worried. Where I grew up, these things don't happen by accident.
That night, Jason and Yegi are leaving their apartment on the way to a party. They step into the elevator, hit the button to go down, and when the door opens, there's a gun in their faces. An imposing group of plainclothes security officers marches them back up to their apartment.
We were separated in our apartments, sitting in 2 different rooms. They were going through our stuff. Everything is happening very loud, and they're screaming at us and scaring us, and started going through more personal stuff, including our tea bags. I'd never forget that. Electronic devices, laptop, phone.
After the search, they're taken to one of Iran's most notorious prisons, the same one Brody was held in before the hanging on Homeland, Evin prison.
In the pre-revolutionary and early revolutionary years, it had a reputation of being a place where people went into and never came out of.
Today, some of Iran's other prisons are worse.
So I think it's now notorious in the sense that it's the place that you're taken to if Iran is trying to make a statement to the world.
But Jason and Yegi aren't exactly agitators. One of Jason's most recent stories was about Iran's emerging baseball scene, and his press pass was recently re-upped for a whole year, a sign he was on at least decent terms with the government. So it takes some time before they come to realize that one of the reasons they've probably been arrested, and one of the reasons that Jason will spend the next 544 days in prison, is the Iran deal. I'm Lacey Healy, and today on Things That Go Boom, we're going to talk about collateral damage. Because when the U.S. entered into negotiations with Iran and when President Trump pulled out, it kicked off a whole series of international events with consequences we're still feeling today. Hey, it's Lacey. As you likely already know, we are living in the golden age of cybercrime. How can we ensure the security of our information and our financials, not to mention our peace of mind? Well, I recommend listening to What the Hack with Adam Levin. It's a weekly true crime podcast featuring tales of hacks, scams, and a rattlebag of cyber swindles. Learn about the dangers of trolling opponents, discover what sort of links you should never, ever click, and get the inside scoop on all sorts of crazy scams happening on your favorite apps. So go ahead, follow What the Hack with Adam Levin on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. When they arrive at Evin prison, Jason and Yegi are separated and taken to solitary confinement.
I described solitary confinement to a grave. They want to kill you, but softly, so they put you in there.
And the not knowing of her whereabouts, her condition.
The conditions are so awful, they actually look forward to their interrogations, which happen a few times a day.
We all have watched this scene that sometimes they bury people while they are still alive. It's the same thing. You are there physically, but you are basically dead to the outside world. It kills your soul. It kills your brain. It makes it overwork, but actually you are going crazy.
And as it turns out, we were probably no more than 100 feet from each other the entire time. We didn't know that.
I mean, everything you think to yourself, I haven't done anything. Why am I even going through this? Why am I here? Why is this happening to us?
But more than anything else, they worry about each other.
For me, I worried about things that I don't want to think about or describe. That they would be doing unspeakable things to my wife.
The days tick by. At some point, Jason's interrogators reveal that the reason he's there is that they believe he's the CIA station chief in Tehran. His emails contain phrases like radio silence that only spies use. And they want to know what's up with a Kickstarter Jason once ran to start a small avocado farm in Iran. Jason's from California, and Iran, somewhat inexplicably, doesn't have avocados. But Jason's interrogators are convinced it's a code.
These guys are not professional. They're clowns. But they're clowns with a lot of power and very little oversight.
I'm a political pawn in the challenging U.S.-Iran relationship.
Outside of Evin prison, Jason and Yegi are caught in the middle of a geopolitical firestorm.
He is paying the price of the suspicion, the animosity, and the paranoia between the two countries
From the outset, the Obama negotiating team has been clear. They won't negotiate on key issues outside the nuclear realm. Jason believes that Iran's hardliners want to scuttle the deal, and that's why they've taken him prisoner.
And I think when you're in that eye of the storm, as we were, and you're so small, so many bad things can happen.
All that said, Jason doesn't think his captors really thought the whole thing out.
You know, it's like the nihilists in Big Lebowski, get a hold of some jackpot, and then all of a sudden are on the world stage trying to figure out what they're going to do with this pot of gold that they found.
But he also knows it doesn't matter if his interrogators have a plan. He's not the only prisoner held in Iran, and some, like Bob Levinson, have been missing for more than a decade.
We were in a very, very precarious set of circumstances. And if things had not gone certain ways on certain days, I might have gotten out sooner. I might have been killed. I might have died from a heart attack in a confrontation with my captors, or I might still be sitting there right now.
It doesn't help that Iran has so many competing power centers with different ideas about Iran's place in the world.
You know, they want to be perceived as a powerful, important regional force, and in some ways they are. They want to be perceived as stable and normal and integrated, and in some ways they should be. At the same time, they want to continue to take part in all sorts of lawless activity, and we're talking specifically about taking hostages. States don't do that. Pirates do that. Terrorist groups do that.
A month goes by, and finally, there's a little spark of hope. And so you are at some point allowed to see each other. How far is it into
35. 37?
Very
It's
specifically.
okay. 2 days. You were there for such a long time, I understand.
I think it was in the mid-30s.
They're brought into a room together, and they're not allowed to speak.
His face had so much pain and sadness to it.
To have this surprise encounter was a shot of energy and hope.
He lost at least, I think by then, 35 pounds. He had a very long beard. The plastic slippers. It's terrible when you see your husband, your loved one, anyone in those prison clothes. As he says, prison blues.
I think of it still as probably the best moment of my life.
Better than the day you found me?
And when that very short encounter ended, Yegi was leaving the room and she said, I want to have your baby. And I said, I do too, and because I'd come to that realization, and I think solitary confinement will do that to you.
That's right.
It's a hallucinogen. It makes you crazy.
Finding a way out, a way back to each other and to their family, it's all that matters.
If there is one good thing, I can't even say it's a good thing about solitary, you realize that, okay, this place is really dark and it's a hole in some wall or ground that I am in this hole. But what was I doing before in the outside world? Or what I want to do when I get out of this place? It's just you want to make the world a little brighter, more loving. And what's better than being loved and giving love?
Yeah, I wasn't sitting there going, I really need to get back to filing daily news stories.
On the day Yegi's released from prison, she begs to stay.
It was like a Wednesday, the early fall days when it gets dark early.
She doesn't want to leave Jason alone.
What if I go out and I never see him again?
But after 72 days, she's free. If you're the nihilist, Jason's probably a bigger get. He works for a U.S. paper. He has a U.S. passport. Outside, negotiations are marching on slowly under the first of 3 extensions of the interim deal. They're waffling back and forth between days where it looks like a final deal is just around the bend and days where it looks like all hope is lost.
So it was not necessarily divorced or a widow or it's like everything is up in the air.
One of the conditions of Yegi's release is that she live with her parents.
You don't know what to do. You don't know if you want to sell this lamp because everything is over, or you want to keep it because you are hoping maybe at some point we can put it in our home in the future if we have a home ever again together. So everything was really confusing, difficult.
I'm glad you didn't sell those lamps.
Friends are asking, what if he's sentenced to 10 years, 14 years? Do you want to stay married? Do you want a divorce? Do you want to leave Iran? Other friends don't want to be seen with her. They're worried for their own safety. One morning, a couple of months after her release, after the weather's turned cold, Yegi wakes up early. And she's done waiting.
I started putting clothes on as if I'm going out, like winter clothes, and my sister asked me, where are you going? I said, I haven't seen him. I don't know his situation. He doesn't have a lawyer. So I guess I have to go out and do something. And she asked me, do you know what office? I said, no, but I'm going to go find out.
She marches to the Revolutionary Court, back to face her captors, to demand her right to see her husband. And she's sent from office to office. She can't get an answer until finally she spots an official she's been waiting to see.
And I just happened to caught him in the corridor because I was sitting behind his door for at least 2 or 3 hours.
He ducks inside his office.
And his secretary told me constantly that no, Haji, that's how they refer to him, he won't see you. I started screaming that this is who I am and I want to talk to you. He said, go back home, and I'll tell you when to come back.
But she stands her ground for 5 more hours.
And I said, I can't. I have been home for the past 2 months. You have to tell me. And finally, by the end of it, he was like, okay, this is Monday. You're going to go see him next Monday. I was like, yes, at least, right? You can't just sit down and pretend you are dead because you are not.
After she stands up for herself, Yegi's granted her right as Jason's wife under Muslim tradition to visit him regularly. And by the time the summer comes, they've fallen into a rhythm. They've even developed their own code for passing information. Secretary of State John Kerry is Uncle John. Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif, is Jay-Z. And Uncle John and Jay-Z are on the brink of a nuclear deal. The day the deal's signed, July 15th, 2015, Jason's been in prison for almost a year to the day. But he's been waiting for this.
I thought that was the most likely time for me to be released.
In July.
Yeah, and the fact that I wasn't was very scary for me, first of all. I became very depressed after that.
Major Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. President. As you well know, there are 4 Americans in Iran, 3 held on trumped-up charges.
In a press conference about the deal, Major Garrett, the chief White House correspondent for CBS News, asked President Obama why he was content.
Can you tell the country, sir, why you are content
with the deal that left 4 Americans languishing in Iranian jails?
with all the fanfare around this deal to leave the conscience of this nation unaccounted for?
The president wasn't pleased.
I got to give you credit, Major, for how you craft those questions. For the notion that I'm content, Major, that's nonsense. And you should know better.
After all that negotiating, the Iran deal did not secure Jason's release.
I wasn't the only person that was angered and saddened and upset by this. But we know now they had been in the midst of secret negotiations over us, but that wasn't something that the president could say.
Jason and Yegi weren't the only ones caught up in the fallout. The nuclear deal was a thorn in the side of Iran's regional adversaries, who didn't appreciate the U.S. running off and sitting at Iran's table for lunch.
Reassuring allies over the nuclear deal with Iran.
The U.S. Defense Secretary isn't just offering moral support to allies in the region. He's thought, according to several news reports, to be bringing with him promises of billions of dollars of conventional weapons.
So in 2015, on the heels of the agreement and in an attempt to reassure our Saudi allies, the Pentagon finalized a $1 billion arms deal to support Saudi Arabia's fight against ISIS and its operations in Yemen.
We begin with the ugly reality of the brutal war in Yemen. Innocent children climbed aboard a school.
At least 20 people died Sunday when a Saudi-led coalition airstrike hit a wedding party in northern Yemen. The bride was among the dead.
Today, Yemen has been devastated, and its people starved in an ongoing proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. By the end of 2019, studies indicate that over 200,000 people will have died, the majority of them children under the age of 5.
Due to malnutrition and disease, water is limited in the country.
Because of civil war, more than 20 million in Yemen face starvation.
And the U.S. has continued to provide support to the Saudi coalition through it all.
The U.S. was right alongside helping them with targeting, with logistics.
Even helping to refuel Saudi planes on bombing runs. In an attempt to stem the flow of arms to the fight, Congress voted in April to end U.S. military involvement in the war. But the vote was vetoed by President Trump, and an emergency arms sale pushed through. Meanwhile, reports indicate that Saudi Arabia is developing its own ballistic missile program, and that's to say nothing of their other activities. The first time we reached out to Jason, in fact, he said he'd have to talk later. His colleague, Jamal Khashoggi, had gone missing. We know now that he would never return. Some have suggested that the Trump administration might have overcorrected when it said that the Iran deal made us look weak. Recently, it came to light that the administration had greenlighted a series of secret authorizations to sell the technology needed to build nuclear reactors to Saudi Arabia, to lay the groundwork for a broader nuclear energy deal. And that has experts concerned, since the whole Middle East ally with peaceful nuclear energy and a sort of sketchy ballistic missile program sounds kind of familiar. Plus, Saudi Arabia has been clear about its intentions if things go south.
Saudi Arabia's crown prince says that if Iran builds nuclear weapons, his country will do the same.
Saudi Arabia does not want to acquire any nuclear bomb. But without a doubt, if Iran developed a nuclear bomb, we will follow suit as soon as possible.
The Iran deal was created to prevent just this sort of arms race in the Middle East. And even though it turned his and Yegi's lives upside down, Jason says he has respect for the effort.
And whether or not that deal was a good idea or not, I think they were very thoughtful in how they got from point A to point B and point C and D. I mean, you know, from starting to isolate Iran, to try to get Iran to negotiate, to ultimately have this deal come together.
He's agnostic on the deal itself, but says once we had it, we should have stayed.
All of that work of building an international consensus, to have it thrown out of the window so quickly and abruptly, is something that I think we'll look back on years from now as a huge failing of the Trump administration.
And like many others we've spoken to this season, he worries about the collateral damage when the U.S. just can't be depended on to lead.
A deal was made, and the United States of America decided to, pick up the ball and walk away from the game. Are the ramifications of that long term, are they worth it?
The fact of the matter is, this isn't just about one little nuclear deal.
What do we as America stand for when we make these kinds of agreements? And apparently right now, we don't stand for very much.
Jason was released from prison after 544 days, on implementation day, the day the deal was set to take effect. We've spent hours upon hours this season digging into the Iran nuclear deal, asking if it was faulty and asking if we're headed into a war. As we finalize this episode, the crisis between the U.S. and Iran has hit a boiling point. The U.S. has accused Iran of attacking oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman, and Iran has responded by downing a U.S. drone and threatening to blow past restrictions on how much nuclear fuel it can produce. The risk of a war is very real. But even beyond war, and maybe even because of the chance of it, what we've realized is that the problem isn't just preventing an Iranian weapon. Maybe you've heard a lot of this lately, but it's about finding a way to prevent the whole system we've depended on since World War II, our allied relationships, the power of the dollar, and the agreements that hold the whole thing together from tumbling down. Sure, Trump's leaving treaties left and right, so maybe at this point, they just feel like pieces of paper. But there's one in particular, a big one, called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that's kind of important. After the U.S. dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the rest of the world started looking for ways to catch up. The science was more accessible and cheaper than before, and in the 60s, it actually started to look like nuclear weapons might spread all over the world. The reason they didn't is that 191 states got together and said, we'll stop if you do too. And with few exceptions, it's worked. For 50 years. But that treaty is growing weaker and weaker by the day as tensions rise between the world's two biggest nuclear powers. the US and Russia. Pulling out of the Iran deal weakened the treaty even more. Because if Iran develops a weapon, what's stopping everyone else? Meanwhile, out in the world, in the midst of what seems like a crisis an hour, all we see is fire and fury, chance of death to America, and we think, nuclear attacks? Pfft, these kinds of things don't actually happen. Remember my mom? She was in Hawaii during the missile scare. When we talked way back in the first episode, I asked her if she thought the warning was real. And she said, oh, definitely. And because of the news, she thought it was an attack, not a missile test. But something about it was off.
It was eerily quiet at the condo. And, people weren't running around screaming or yelling or anything that you might think.
She said this to me more than once.
You would imagine if there's some kind of a major catastrophe like that you'd hear screaming and yelling or people panicking or, I don't know, or sirens or something. It was deathly quiet there.
At the time, it struck me as so odd. Like she was waiting for a scene out of the movies. But then I heard about this phenomenon in social science called the third-person bias, which shows up in people when they're faced with warnings of danger, especially with things like hurricanes and tornadoes. What they do is that instead of sheltering in their basements, they go to the window and they look to see if danger's on the way. They think, maybe it's going to be somebody else and not me who's in danger. They need proof. As countries around the world upgrade their stockpiles, arms control agreements collapse, negotiations break down, nuclear tensions rise, and efforts to prevent nuclear terrorism fall by the wayside, the rest of us are searching the bad news for proof. Proof that the threat of nuclear weapons, the one we can't see, is really capable of hurting us. And not just someone else. We listen for the sirens. And when we don't hear them going off, we make a joke about a pink fallout shelter and go back to our lives. But then, hey, maybe those doomsday preppers aren't so crazy. Remember Ron from episode 1, the guy who sells those fancy fallout shelters? I decided to call him back up. So what does that mean if I want to put that into an existing house? Do I dig up my backyard or...
Now, we can put the shelter under the driveway and cut into the garage. And
just
that way,
keeping my options open. I'm all about the wine cellar.
And you look at one called Wine NATO.
Yeah.
I mean, we illustrate it as a gun room and a wine cellar. The bells and whistles usually include a movie room. We even got one where it's got lavender couches and stripper poles in it. Well, it has really good acoustics in it. So, but yeah.
Things That Go Boom is a production of PRX and Inkstick Media. Our show is produced by Ruth Morris. Catherine Fink is our assistant producer, and Mary Beth Kirshner is our story whisperer. Darian Schulman composes our music, and our engineer is Robin Wise. A huge thank you to John Barth and Kelsey Davenport for their review, and to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, Plowshares Fund, and N Square for making our show possible. This is our final episode of the season. If you like what you heard, please head over and leave us a review. Those things are a big deal in the podcasting world. And seriously, come see us on social at Inkstick Media. We'll be hard at work on season 3 and always love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
I'm in Dallas area, and bunkers and guns go together in Dallas like peanut butter and jelly does with the rest of the United States. I mean, if you're a red-blooded Texan, you want a bunker with a bunch of guns.
From PRX.